Today, we're going to be exploring something pretty fascinating and a little bit unsettling. We're talking about the influence of right-wing think tanks
Oh, yeah.
on global policy,
Powerful stuff.
particularly how climate protests are being criminalized.
Yeah.
We've got excerpts from two really interesting articles.
Okay.
Meet the shadowy global network of right-wing think tanks from the New Republic. And what links Rishi Sunak, Javier Milei, and Donald Trump, the shadowy network behind their policies from The Guardian.
Yeah, saw that one.
So by the end of this deep dive, I think you'll have a much better understanding of how these groups are shaping the world around us.
Yeah, it really is amazing. You know, these organizations, they operate mostly behind the scenes, but have a massive impact on decisions made by, presidents and prime ministers worldwide.
I know, it's like they're pulling strings we don't even see.
Yeah.
So let's start with this thing called the Atlas Network.
Okay.
It's described as a global network of over 500 free market think tanks. That's a lot of brain power pushing a particular agenda.
It certainly is. And what's interesting is how deeply interconnected these think tanks are. For instance, the Atlas Network was founded by Anthony Fisher, who also established the UK's Institute of Economic Affairs, the IEA.
Oh, the IEA. Didn't they play a big role in Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget as prime minister?
They did indeed. The IEA advocated for radical tax cuts and deregulation. And those ideas formed the core of Truss's economic plan. The result, market turmoil, a sharp drop in the value of the pound and soaring borrowing costs. It ultimately forced her resignation.
Wow.
It's a prime example of how think tank ideology can translate into real-world consequences.
It's like a real-life experiment gone wrong.
Right.
But what's the story behind this Anthony Fisher and his think tank crusade? The articles paint him as quite the character.
Anthony Fisher's journey is a fascinating one.
Yeah.
After World War II, he was deeply concerned about the rise of socialism in Britain. He believed it stifled individual liberty and economic growth. So he was influenced by the economist Friedrich Hayek, who saw capitalism as the path to prosperity and freedom. Fisher dedicated himself to promoting free market ideas.
So Hayek kind of pointed him towards a war of ideas instead of traditional politics.
Right.
And that's where the IEA came in.
Precisely. Fisher founded the IEA in 1955. And right from the start, he was very strategic. He secured funding from major corporations like Royal Dutch Shell and BP,
Wow.
understanding the need for financial backing to amplify his message.
So even back then, there was this connection between big business and think tanks pushing for deregulation.
Absolutely. And Fisher cleverly employed academics to write accessible articles
Okay.
that champion free market principles. These articles were then distributed widely by wealthy donors, reaching a vast audience.
Clever.
Yeah.
Did they disclose those corporate ties?
Not at all.
Yeah.
And that's a key part of their strategy. One of the articles quotes a researcher saying, the think tank method allowed corporations to say things that they couldn't say themselves without appearing to be merely speaking to their own profit motives. It allowed them to advance their interests without appearing self-serving, which, let's face it, is still a tactic used today, isn't it?
It makes you realize how important it is to always consider the source of information and their potential motivations.
Absolutely.
We can't just take things at face value.
Understanding the historical context and the forces behind the information we consume is crucial. Now, Fisher didn't stop with the IEA. He had global ambitions.
And that's where this web starts to spread internationally.
Yes, Fisher saw the need to export these ideas globally. He was particularly focused on Latin America, a region with strong leftist movements that threaten the interests of corporations, especially those involved in mining and resource extraction.
And wasn't this around the time the Koch brothers became major players in the Atlas Network? Those guys have a reputation for promoting free market ideology and opposing environmental regulations.
Yes, their involvement, along with funding from various extractive industries, was instrumental in the Atlas Network's expansion. They saw these think tanks as a powerful tool to influence policy and shape public opinion in their favor.
It's pretty wild to think how these networks have quietly shaped the global conversation around economics and environmental issues. It's a lot to absorb,
It is.
but knowing about it is the first step, right?
Absolutely. Recognizing these connections and understanding their tactics helps us navigate this complex landscape and form our own opinions.
Okay, so we've established this link between corporate interests and the spread of free market think tanks.
Right.
But what specifically about environmentalists and these climate protests? The articles paint a pretty unsettling picture of how these groups are being targeted.
Right. The way they're framing environmentalists is quite alarming. These think tanks consistently portray environmental regulations as a threat to society and economic growth. They use this rhetoric to undermine support for environmental protection and justify harsher measures against activists.
Like calling environmentalists anti-human.
Yes.
Or claiming that environmental improvement is a success story already.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They've even compared environmentalists to terrorists.
Wow.
This kind of language is dangerous because it creates a climate of fear and hostility, making it easier to dismiss their concerns and their goals.
It seems like they're trying to paint any form of environmental activism as extreme and radical.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
By shaping public perception in this way, they create a more favorable environment for their own agenda, which often involves deregulation and promoting the interest of extractive industries.
So how does all this translate into actual policies and actions against climate protesters?
Right.
The articles mention this trend of criminalization, and it's pretty frightening.
It's a disturbing trend indeed. Let's take a look at a few specific examples to see how this plays out in different countries.
Okay, let's do it. I'm ready to unpack some of these cases and see how this rhetoric translates into real-world consequences.
Let's start with Germany.
Okay.
There we see how the rhetoric of a think tank connected to the Atlas network has fueled the crackdown on climate activists.
Oh, this is about Frank Scheffler.
Yes.
He's a member of the German parliament, right?
Yes. Scheffler is affiliated with the Hayek Institute, a think tank that's part of the Atlas network.
Okay.
He's repeatedly labeled activist groups like Last Generation as terrorists and criminal organizations.
That's heavy stuff. Did anything come of those accusations?
Unfortunately, yes. Following Scheffler's statements, police raided the homes of Last Generation activists and froze their bank accounts.
Wow. That's a pretty extreme reaction. It's scary how easily words can be used to justify such drastic measures.
It shows how this rhetoric can create a climate where dissent is viewed as a threat,
Right.
paving the way for more authoritarian actions.
And it seems like this isn't just a German phenomenon. The articles highlight similar trends in other parts of the world.
Right.
What's another example?
Let's look at Guatemala. There an Atlas-linked think tank called Fundesa played a key role in demonizing indigenous-led protests against extractive projects.
So are we talking about protests against mining or logging operations that were impacting indigenous communities?
Exactly. Fundesa framed these protests as a threat to national security and economic stability. This led to the imprisonment of activist Bernardo Calazol, who was defending his community's land and water.
It's heartbreaking how those defending their land and environment are often the ones being silenced and punished.
And it's a pattern we see repeated in many places.
Okay, so we've got Germany and Guatemala. What about closer to home? Did anything similar happen in the UK?
The UK provides another stark example. Policy Exchange, a think tank with close ties to the Conservative Party and previously part of the Atlas network, published a report labeling Extinction Rebellion as an extremist organization.
And that's the group known for their disruptive protests, right? Blocking roads and such.
Yes. Policy Exchange's report was widely cited by politicians and media outlets, creating a hostile environment for the group. It contributed to the UK government passing legislation that criminalized certain forms of protest, leading Extinction Rebellion to abandon their most disruptive tactics.
It's chilling how think tanks with political connections can influence legislation and public opinion so effectively. It's like they're setting the stage for these crackdowns.
And it's not limited to Europe. Let's move across the Atlantic to North America.
Okay.
In Canada and the US, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, an Atlas network member, has been particularly active in promoting a narrative that's had a chilling effect on Indigenous activism.
What have they been saying?
They've been pushing the idea that First Nations activists protesting pipelines and other extractive projects are potentially violent and a threat to national security.
That's awful. Those are often the communities most affected by environmental destruction. It's like they're being silenced for speaking out against injustice.
Their reports have influenced the passage of anti-protest laws and even impacted police tactics when dealing with Indigenous-led protests. We see a clear pattern here. Think tanks with an agenda using their influence to shape policy and public perception in a way that benefits powerful interests, often at the expense of those most vulnerable.
This is really heavy stuff. It's disturbing to see how these tactics are being used to silence dissent and criminalize those fighting for a better future.
I agree. It's important to remember that these aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a broader, coordinated effort to undermine environmental activism and protect the status quo.
So criminalizing protests is one tactic, but are there other strategies these think tanks employ? What else do these articles reveal?
Oh, they have a whole playbook. Let's dive into some of their other tactics, starting with something called red washing. It's a more subtle approach, but no less insidious.
Okay, I'm all ears. Explain red washing to me. What's that all about?
Red washing is essentially an attempt to co-opt opposition to extractive projects by making indigenous communities equity partners. On the surface, it sounds like a win-win. Indigenous communities get a share of the profits, and companies get to claim they're operating in a socially responsible way.
But something tells me it's not that simple. What's the catch?
The problem is that this strategy often serves to silence dissent by creating a financial incentive for communities to support projects that may ultimately harm their land and culture. It's a way to divide communities and weaken opposition to these projects.
So it's like buying their silence with a piece of the pie, even if that pie is ultimately poisonous.
That's a good way to put it. And this tactic is being employed in various parts of the world, including Canada and Australia, where think tanks have pushed for indigenous ownership in mining and resource extraction ventures.
Wow. It's amazing how they can spin something that sounds positive on the surface into a tool for furthering their agenda. But it's not just indigenous communities they're targeting, right? What about the youth climate movement?
That's another interesting example. The rise of the youth climate movement has really rattled the extractive industry and the think tanks that support them.
Yeah, I remember reading about leaked BP documents that revealed how worried the industry was about the youth movement's impact on public opinion and investor sentiment.
Exactly. They saw it as a genuine threat to their business model. And the think tanks responded accordingly with a wave of criticism and fear-mongering aimed at discrediting the movement, particularly its most prominent figure, Greta Thunberg.
That's just sad. Attacking a teenager for speaking out about the future of the planet. What kind of tactics did they use?
We've compared youth activists to Nazis, accused them of economic illiteracy, and even tried to promote a German YouTuber as an anti-Greta.
It's almost pathetic how they've resorted to these ad hominem attacks and attempts to control the narrative. It just shows how threatened they are by the power of young voices demanding action.
Their reaction highlights just how effective the youth climate movement has been in challenging the status quo. It's a testament to the power of grassroots activism and the importance of speaking truth to power, even when faced with intense opposition.
It's inspiring to see young people taking a stand and demanding a better future. It gives me hope.
Me too. Their courage and determination are a powerful antidote to the cynicism and apathy that these think tanks often promote. Their voices are being heard, and they're not going away anytime soon.
So we've talked about how these think tanks try to influence policy co-opt communities and discredit their opponents. But what about the media? How have they managed to shape the narrative in mainstream news outlets?
It's a complex issue, but their influence is definitely there. They have connections to journalists, provide experts for interviews, and often frame issues in a way that aligns with their agenda. It's not always overt, but it's definitely a factor.
So it's not like they're directly controlling the media, but they're definitely working behind the scenes to shape the conversation.
Exactly. They understand the power of narratives and framing, and they're very good at it.
Can you give us some specific examples of how this plays out in media coverage?
One example is how they've managed to frame climate activists as radical and extreme, even when those activists are simply advocating for policies that are in line with scientific consensus. They often focus on the tactics of protesters, like blocking roads or disrupting events, rather than the substance of their demands.
Right. It's like they're trying to shift the focus away from the issue of climate change itself and make it about the supposed incivility of the protesters.
Exactly, and it's a very effective strategy. It allows them to discredit the movement without actually having to engage with the science or the arguments for climate action.
It's really frustrating to see how they've been able to manipulate public perception in this way. It makes it harder for people to understand the urgency of the climate crisis and the need for bold action.
It does, and it highlights the importance of media literacy and critical thinking. We need to be aware of the biases and agendas at play and be able to discern fact from fiction.
You mentioned the Media Matters study earlier. What else did they find about media coverage of these issues?
They found that there was very limited coverage of the actual issue of climate protest criminalization. Many outlets focused on the tactics of protesters rather than the underlying issues driving their actions or the concerning trend of governments restricting protest rights.
So it's not just about how they frame the protesters, it's also about what they choose to cover and what they leave out.
Precisely. It's about agenda setting and controlling the narrative. And they've been remarkably successful at it.
It's a bit disheartening to realize how much influence they have. It makes you feel like you're constantly battling against a tide of misinformation.
I understand that feeling, but it's important not to give in to despair. The fact that we're having this conversation, that we're aware of these tactics, is a positive step.
You're right. Awareness is the first step to resistance. But what comes next? What can we do to counter these powerful forces and reclaim the narrative?
That's the million-dollar question. We were discussing some of the unsettling tactics these right-wing think tanks are using to undermine environmental activism. From Germany to Guatemala, the UK to Canada, it's a pattern that's becoming increasingly globalized.
It's definitely a lot to take in, but you mentioned that there's more to their playbook than just criminalizing protests. You brought up this red washing thing as another strategy.
Right.
Can you remind us what that is and how it works?
Of course. Red washing involves making indigenous communities equity partners in extractive projects.
Okay.
On the surface, it seems like a good deal. Indigenous communities get a share of the profits. Companies get to claim they're operating responsibly.
Right, but you said there's a darker side to it.
Exactly. It often creates a financial incentive for communities to support projects that might harm their land and culture in the long run. It's a way to divide communities and silence those who might otherwise oppose the project.
So it's like they're being paid to stay silent.
Essentially, yes. It's happening in Canada and Australia, where think tanks have pushed for indigenous ownership in mining ventures.
It's a really clever tactic. It makes it harder to criticize the project when some members of the affected community are benefiting financially. It's almost like they're being used as shields for the corporations.
That's a good way to put it. It's a way to co-opt opposition and present a facade of inclusivity while pushing through projects that ultimately benefit corporations and their investors. And it can be really effective in silencing dissent.
It's kind of disturbing to think how these tactics are being used to manipulate communities and undermine genuine environmental concerns. It's not just about winning arguments, it's about controlling the narrative and silencing those who disagree.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we need to be critical of seemingly win-win solutions and look deeper to understand the potential long-term consequences, especially for communities who are already marginalized and vulnerable. We can't just accept things at face value.
You're right, we need to be asking, who benefits from this? Who's being left out of the conversation? What are the long-term impacts?
Exactly. We can't just focus on the immediate benefits. We need to consider the broader context and the potential downsides, especially for those who might not have a voice at the table. We've been exploring how these right-wing think tanks are shaping the global narrative around climate change and working to undermine environmental activism.
It's been pretty intense, but knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. Understanding their tactics is the first step toward countering them.
So let's talk about solutions.
Okay.
It can feel overwhelming to think about challenging these powerful, well-funded networks.
It can.
What can we as individuals actually do to make a difference?
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you said knowledge is power. The more people understand these tactics,
right?
The red washing, the media manipulation, the attempts to discredit activists, the less effective those tactics become.
So education is a big part of it, just spreading awareness about what's going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. Talk to your friends, share articles on social media, write to your elected officials. The more people understand the issue, the more we can build a movement for change.
That makes sense. But beyond raising awareness, what are some concrete actions we can take? The articles mention supporting organizations fighting for climate justice. What does that look like in practice?
There are some incredible organizations doing amazing work on the ground, challenging these think tanks, and advocating for a more just and sustainable future. Groups like 350.org, Greenpeace, and the Sunrise Movement are leading the fight for climate action. You can support them through donations, volunteering, or simply amplifying their message.
So putting our money and time where our mouth is, basically.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of individual action. Even small things like reducing your own carbon footprint, choosing sustainable products, and engaging in conversations about climate change can have a ripple effect.
It's about changing the culture, right? Moving away from this consumerist mindset and embracing a more sustainable way of life.
Absolutely. We need to create a world where sustainability is not just an option, but the norm.
And that ties into supporting businesses and politicians who are committed to climate action.
Yes. Voting with your wallet and your ballot is crucial. Support businesses that are environmentally responsible and politicians who have a strong track record on climate change. Make it clear that you prioritize these issues when making your choices.
It's about sending a message that we're not going to stand for business as usual anymore.
Exactly. We need to demand better from our leaders and from the corporations that have so much influence over our lives.
Speaking of corporations, what about holding them accountable for their actions? The articles talk about these close ties between think tanks and industries like fossil fuels. How can we break those connections?
Divestment is a powerful tool. Many universities, cities, and even pension funds have committed to divesting from fossil fuel companies. You can join campaigns urging institutions to divest, or if you have investments, you can choose to move your money into more sustainable options.
So hitting them where it hurts their wallets.
Exactly. When they start to feel the financial pressure, they'll be more likely to change their behavior.
It all feels very interconnected, doesn't it? Changing our individual habits, supporting the right organizations and politicians, putting pressure on corporations. It's about a systemic shift, not just isolated actions.
You're absolutely right. It's about creating a web of resistance, a network of individuals and organizations working together to push for a more just and sustainable future.
I like that, a web of resistance. It feels empowering to think that even in the face of these powerful think tanks, we're not powerless.
Right.
We can build our own networks, amplify our voices, and demand better.
And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a long game. But every action, every conversation, every dollar donated, every vote cast contributes to building a better future.
That's a really hopeful way to look at it. It can feel daunting, but knowing that our actions, even small ones, can contribute to something bigger is really motivating.
Exactly. And it's important to celebrate the victories along the way, no matter how small they may seem. Every step forward, every policy change, every shift in public opinion is a sign that we're moving in the right direction.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. This deep dive has been quite a journey, into this shadowy world of right-wing think tanks and their influence on global policy. We unpacked how their rhetoric and strategies have shaped legislation, public perception, or even the criminalization of protests. We explored how these seemingly benign organizations are really shaping the world around us.
Yeah.
But we've also explored how crucial it is to be aware of these influences, to think critically about the information we consume, and to engage in collective action to build a more just and sustainable world.
It's not easy, but it's necessary.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been great.
We hope you learned something new and feel empowered to take action. Remember, the future is not predetermined. It's up to us to shape it.